"Sir, you need to get to a hospital. Now." The words cut through the smoke-filled room like a blade. Richard Torino's vision blurred as he gripped the edge of his marble desk, blood seeping through his expensive white shirt. 3 rival families had just declared war. His territory was under siege, and his body was betraying him at the worst possible moment. "No hospitals," he rasped, his voice barely recognizable. "Too dangerous." The blonde woman standing in his doorway shouldn't have been there. J.D. Martinez, 25, emergency room nurse, had followed his wounded Lieutenant Marco inside when he'd stumbled into Chicago General an hour ago. She wasn't supposed to see this. The underground office, the armed guards, the evidence of what Richard Torino really was. But here she was, medical bag in hand, fearless blue eyes assessing his condition like he was just another patient instead of the most feared man in Chicago. "You're dying," she said bluntly, stepping closer despite the guns trained on her. "Internal bleeding, possible organ failure. Whatever vendetta you think is more important than your life, it won't matter if you're dead." Richard's knees nearly buckled. For 8 months, he'd been hiding his deteriorating health from everyone. The dizziness, the constant pain, the nights spent vomiting blood in private. His empire depended on projecting strength, on his enemies believing Richard Torino was invincible. Now this nurse with gentle hands and steel in her spine had seen through his facade in seconds. "Before we continue," J.D. said suddenly, surprising him, "I know this might sound crazy given the circumstances, but if you're watching this story unfold, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and it helps me continue bringing you these dramatic stories." Now back to Richard and J.D. She knelt beside his chair, ignoring the weapons surrounding her. "Let me help you. That's what I do. I save lives." "I don't deserve saving," Richard whispered, thinking of the blood on his hands, the choices that had led him here. "That's not my decision to make," J.D. replied firmly. "My job is keeping you alive. Your job is letting me." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them. Here was a woman who looked at him and saw not a monster, but a human being in pain. It terrified him more than any rival's threat ever had. "Marco," Richard managed, "clear the room. Clear. All of you out." "Boss, we can't." "Out!" The command came with enough force to remind everyone why Richard still controlled half of Chicago's underworld. As the door closed, leaving them alone, J.D.'s expression softened slightly. "What's your name? Your real first name?" "Richard," he said, studying her face. "Richard Torino." "Richard," she repeated, already reaching for her stethoscope. "I'm J.D. Martinez, and I'm going to need you to trust me completely if you want to live through the night." 3 hours later, Richard's private penthouse had been transformed into a makeshift medical unit. J.D. had called in favors, acquiring equipment and medications through channels that didn't require explanations. She worked with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to life or death situations. "Your blood pressure is dangerously low," she murmured, adjusting an IV line. "When did you last eat something that stayed down?" Richard tried to remember. Days blurred together when you were running an empire, while your body systematically shut down. "Tuesday, maybe." "It's Friday, Richard." J.D.'s voice carried a hint of professional exasperation. "No wonder you're circling the drain." Despite everything, the pain, the chaos outside his doors, the fact that this woman had essentially kidnapped him for his own good, Richard almost smiled. When had anyone last spoken to him with such casual authority? "My family will be looking for me," he said quietly. "Not blood family. The organization. They think I'm negotiating with the Venturas downtown. How long do we have?" "Until morning. Maybe less if the meeting goes badly." J.D. nodded, checking his pulse. Her fingers were warm against his wrist, steady and sure. "Tell me about the symptoms. Everything. Don't leave out details because you think they're embarrassing or unimportant." Richard found himself talking, describing months of pain he'd hidden from everyone. J.D. listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, making notes on her phone. She was thorough, professional, but there was something else, genuine concern in her eyes that he hadn't expected. "Richard," she said finally, "I think I know what's wrong with you, but you're not going to like the treatment. Tell me. Complete rest, stress reduction, proper nutrition, basically everything that's impossible with your current lifestyle." She met his gaze directly. "You've given yourself a stress-induced autoimmune condition. Your body is attacking itself because you've pushed it beyond human limits for too long. Richard laughed. Short and bitter. So the cure for being a mob boss is to stop being a mob boss. The cure for dying young is taking care of yourself, JD corrected. What you do for work is your business. How you treat your body is mine, if you want my help. Something in her tone made him study her more carefully. JD Martinez wasn't just professionally competent, she was genuinely fearless. Most people couldn't even make eye contact with him at charity events. This woman was lecturing him about self-care while surrounded by evidence of his criminal empire. Why aren't you afraid of me? He asked suddenly. JD paused in organizing her medical supplies. Should I be? Most people are. Most people don't spend their shifts in emergency rooms dealing with gangbangers, addicts, and domestic violence cases, she replied pragmatically. I've seen worse than you, Richard Torino. The way she said his full name, like she was testing how it sounded, sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. His phone buzzed. Marco's name flashed on the screen. The meeting's over, Richard said, reading the message. We won, for now. Good, JD said simply. That means you can focus on getting better, instead of getting dead. Richard woke to the smell of actual breakfast cooking. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The sensation of feeling rested, of waking without immediate pain, was so foreign that it took several seconds to orient himself. JD stood at his kitchen island, somehow having transformed his barely used gourmet kitchen into something functional. She'd changed from her medical scrubs into jeans and a soft blue sweater that made her eyes look even more striking. You slept 12 hours, she announced without turning around. When did you last do that? Richard sat up carefully, amazed that the movement didn't send stabbing pain through his abdomen. I can't remember. That tells me everything I need to know about your lifestyle. JD placed a plate in front of him, eggs Benedict with perfectly poached eggs, toast cut into precise triangles, fresh fruit arranged like a small work of art. Eat. All of it. Where did you learn to cook like this? Culinary school. Before nursing school. Before I realized I'd rather save lives than feed rich people. JD poured coffee into an expensive cup, black with 1 sugar, exactly how he preferred it, though he'd never told her. I've been researching your condition all night. The good news is it's treatable. The bad news is it requires significant lifestyle changes. Richard took a bite. The food was extraordinary, each flavor carefully balanced. He couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted anything this good. What kind of changes? Regular sleep, proper nutrition, stress management, exercise that isn't running from bullets or beating people up. JD's tone was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held a hint of amusement. I'm guessing none of those are currently part of your routine. Running this organization will collapse completely if you die, she interrupted. Which you will, probably within the month, if you continue on your current path. The blunt assessment should have angered him. Instead, Richard found himself appreciating her honesty. People had been lying to him, telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, for so long that hearing unvarnished truth felt like a revelation. So what are you proposing? He asked. I move in, temporarily. Monitor your recovery, manage your medication, make sure you don't immediately revert to self-destructive behavior the moment you feel slightly better. JD sipped her coffee, watching his reaction. Think of me as your personal medical supervisor. You want to move in? Here? Richard gestured around the penthouse. With me? I want to keep you alive, JD corrected. Your address is irrelevant to me professionally. Professionally. The word stung, though Richard couldn't quite identify why. This isn't a typical doctor-patient relationship, he pointed out. Nothing about you is typical, Richard. She leaned against the counter, studying him. But that doesn't change the medical reality. You need intensive monitoring and lifestyle modification, or you'll be dead before Christmas. Richard's phone exploded with notifications, texts, calls, messages from his lieutenants about territory disputes, business deals, problems that required his immediate attention. The familiar tension began building in his shoulders. Turn it off, JD said quietly. What? The phone. Turn it off. For 1 hour, let your empire run itself while you finish breakfast. Richard stared at her. You don't understand. I understand that you've created an organization so dependent on your micromanagement that it can't function for 60 minutes without you. Her voice was gentle but implacable. That's not strength, Richard. That's a symptom of the same control issues that are killing you. She was right. The realization hit him with uncomfortable clarity. When had he become so essential to every minor decision that his people couldn't handle basic problems independently? Slowly, Richard turned off his phone. Ika, you're doing it wrong. Richard looked up from the treadmill, sweat dripping down his face after only 10 minutes of what JD generously called light exercise. She stood beside him with a disapproving expression, arms crossed. There's a wrong way to walk on a treadmill? There's a wrong way to do everything when you're recovering from months of self-abuse, JD replied, adjusting the machine's settings. Slower pace, longer duration. Your body needs to relearn what normal feels like. It had been a week since she'd moved into the penthouse's guest room. 7 days of scheduled meals, enforced sleep schedules, and the strangest sense of domestic normalcy Richard had ever experienced. His organization hadn't collapsed. His enemies hadn't sensed weakness. The world had continued spinning without his constant intervention. More unsettling was how much he enjoyed JD's presence. She'd turned his sterile, barely lived-in apartment into something that felt like a home. Books appeared on coffee tables. Actual food filled the refrigerator, and the constant underlying tension that had defined his existence for years had begun to ease. "How long have you been a nurse?" he asked, following her instruction to slow down. 5 years. Started right out of school. JD made notes on a tablet, tracking his vitals. Emergency medicine mostly, trauma cases. Why emergency medicine? Most people prefer less stressful specialties. JD was quiet for a moment, and Richard sensed he'd touched on something significant. "I like problems that have solutions," she said finally. "Someone comes in bleeding, you stop the bleeding. Heart attack, you restart the heart. It's straightforward, no ambiguity. What about problems that don't have clear solutions?" Their eyes met in the mirror facing the treadmill. The question hung between them, loaded with subtext neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "Those are more complicated," JD admitted. Richard's phone, now only turned on for scheduled periods, chimed with a message from Marco. The Castellanos were pushing into their territory again, testing whether Richard's recent absence indicated weakness. "I need to handle this," Richard said, reaching for the emergency stop button. "No," JD's hand covered his, preventing him from stopping the machine. "You need to finish your workout. Let Marco handle whatever crisis has everyone panicked this time." "JD, you don't understand." "I understand that every day for the past week there's been some urgent crisis that only you could solve, and every day your people have somehow managed to solve it without you." Her fingers remained on his, warm and surprisingly steady. "What I don't understand is why you trust them to handle your money, your operations, your life, but not a simple territorial dispute." Richard stared down at their joined hands. When had he become so accustomed to her touch? When had her presence become essential to his sense of balance? "Because if I show weakness, I'm dead," he said quietly, "and everyone who depends on me dies with me." "Who taught you that?" "My father, my uncle, every man who came before me in this business. And where are they now?" The question hit like a physical blow. Dead, all of them dead before 50, consumed by the same paranoia and control that was killing Richard. "That's different," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" JD removed her hand, leaving his feelings strangely cold. "Or are you just the next in a long line of men who confused fear with respect, control with strength?" The treadmill's steady rhythm filled the silence as Richard processed her words. No one had ever challenged his fundamental assumptions about leadership, power, survival in his world. "So what do you suggest?" he asked finally. "Trust your people to do their jobs. Focus on getting healthy. And maybe consider the possibility that showing vulnerability occasionally might actually make you stronger, not weaker." Richard's instinct was to dismiss her words as naive civilian thinking, but as he looked at JD, this woman who'd walked fearlessly into his world, who'd saved his life, who somehow made him feel more like himself than he had in years, he wondered if maybe she understood strength better than he did. Momentum, the attack came at 2 a.m., shattering the illusion of safety Richard had allowed himself to build. He woke to the sound of splintering wood and immediately reached for the gun he kept in his nightstand, but JD was already moving. She appeared in his doorway dressed in dark clothes, her medical bag in one hand and something metallic in the other. "How many?" she asked, her voice completely calm. "How many what?" Richard struggled to orient himself, still groggy from the deeper sleep he'd been getting since starting treatment. "Armed intruders. I count at least 4, possibly 6. JD moved to the window, peering through the blinds. "They're professionals. Cut the building's security before entering." Richard stared at her, recognizing the efficient way she assessed the threat, the lack of panic in her movements. "JD, what?" "Later. Right now, we need to get you somewhere secure." She tossed him clothes from his dresser. "Get dressed?" Quietly. "How do you know about—" "I said later, Richard." The sharpness in her voice brooked no argument. "Move." Richard pulled on pants and a shirt, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time his penthouse had been targeted, but it was the first time he'd been caught this unprepared. More concerning was JD's reaction. This wasn't how a civilian should respond to mortal danger. The sound of footsteps in his living room made them both freeze. "Safe room?" JD whispered. "Behind the bookshelf, but—" "Show me." Richard led her to the hidden panel, his hands shaking slightly as he input the code. Not from fear. He'd faced death before, but from confusion. Nothing about this situation made sense. The safe room was equipped with communications equipment, weapons, and enough supplies to wait out a siege. JD examined everything with professional efficiency, as if she'd seen similar setups before. "Who are you?" Richard asked quietly as she checked the secure phone line. JD paused in her inventory of his weapons cache. In the dim emergency lighting, her face looked different, harder, older, like someone who'd seen more than emergency room trauma. "I'm exactly who I said I was," she replied. "A nurse who wanted to help you. Nurses don't know tactical assessment. They don't carry concealed weapons. They don't stay calm during armed invasions." Richard moved closer to her. "So I'll ask again. Who are you, really?" Before JD could answer, the safe room's communication system crackled to life. Marco's voice filled the small space. "Boss, we've got the situation contained. 4 men down, 2 escaped. You okay in there?" Richard keyed the microphone. "We're fine. What was the target?" "You. Specifically. Castellano operation. But someone fed them inside information. They knew exactly where to find your bedroom, your security protocols, everything." Richard's blood went cold. Only his innermost circle knew those details. Someone he trusted had sold him out. "I'll be out in 5 minutes," he said. As he turned back to JD, he found her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "Now you know why I can't just focus on getting healthy," he said quietly. "This world doesn't allow for rest, for trust, for normal relationships with people like me?" JD's voice was soft, but something in her eyes had changed. "Richard, there's something you need to know about why I was really at the hospital that night." The confession hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Richard suddenly wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Mafia boss was dying. Only a nurse knew what to do. It wasn't medicine. Chapters 6 to 12. "I'm not just a nurse." "Richard." JD's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she set down her medical bag. "I'm FBI, Organized Crime Task Force." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd suspected she was hiding something, but this changed everything. The woman who'd saved his life, who'd made him feel human again, who'd been sleeping down the hall for a week, was federal law enforcement. "How long?" His voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years, undercover. I've been building a case against the Castellanos." JD met his eyes, unflinching. "That night at the hospital wasn't coincidence. Marco led us right to you when he came in wounded." Richard's mind raced through every conversation, every moment of vulnerability he'd shared with her. Everything was a lie. Not everything. She stepped closer, and he noticed she wasn't reaching for a weapon or backup. "The medical treatment was real. Your condition, your recovery, all real. And Richard," her voice softened, "what I feel for you is real. You feel something for your target." The words tasted bitter. "I feel something for the man who cuts off crusts when he makes sandwiches because he thinks I prefer them that way. The man who hasn't raised his voice once in a week, despite controlling an empire built on violence. The man who's been carrying the weight of his father's legacy since he was barely an adult." Richard wanted to walk away, to retreat behind the walls he'd built over decades of survival, but JD's words rang with a sincerity that cut through his defenses. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because someone in your organization is feeding information to both the Castellanos and my task force." Her expression hardened. Tonight's attack wasn't random, Richard. Someone wanted you dead badly enough to risk exposing federal surveillance." The implications hit him like a sledgehammer. "You think the mole is working for the FBI? I think the mole is playing all sides, feeding intelligence to your enemies while collecting a federal paycheck." JD pulled out her phone, showing him a series of encrypted messages. I've been tracking communication patterns. Someone's been reporting your movements, your health status, even details about our relationship. Richard stared at the messages, recognizing the timing of several that coincided with his private moments with JD. Someone had been watching them, documenting their growing connection. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. "You arrest me." "I should." JD's voice was barely audible. 3 years of work. Everything I need to bring down your operation. But Richard, if I do that, you'll be dead within a week. Then a bee. The mole will make sure of it. The safe room's small space suddenly felt suffocating. Richard looked at this woman who'd turned his world upside down in every possible way. "What are you proposing?" "We work together. Find the mole, eliminate the threat to your life, and then—" She paused, vulnerability flickering across her features. "Then we figure out what this is between us." Richard's secure phone buzzed. Marco again. "Boss, we need you upstairs. Found something you need to see." As they emerged from the safe room, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change irrevocably. JD walked beside him, no longer just his nurse or his federal adversary, but something more complicated, a partner in an impossible situation. The evidence Marco presented made Richard's blood run cold. Surveillance photos of him and JD scattered across his dining table, intimate moments from the past week, medical consultations, shared meals, even the quiet conversation they'd had on his balcony 2 nights ago. Someone had been watching, documenting, preparing. "Found these in Tony's apartment," Marco said grimly, along with 50,000 in cash and a burner phone with Castellano contacts. Tony Moretti, Richard's trusted financial advisor, the man who'd helped him build legitimate business fronts, who'd been like an uncle since Richard's father died. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "Where is he now?" Richard's voice was Arctic calm. "Disappeared. Probably halfway to Miami by now." Marco glanced at JD, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. "Boss, we need to talk about—" "She stays," Richard said firmly. "Anything you need to say, she can hear." JD stepped closer to the table, studying the photographs with professional detachment. "These aren't amateur surveillance. Professional equipment, a strategic positioning, pattern recognition." She picked up one image, Richard laughing at something she'd said during breakfast. "Whoever took these knew exactly what they were looking for." "What do you mean?" Marco asked. "They were documenting vulnerability. Richard showing emotion, letting his guard down, trusting someone." JD's voice was clinical, but Richard caught the slight tremor when she mentioned trust. "Classic intelligence gathering. Find the weakness. Exploit it." Richard studied the photos more carefully. In every image he looked different than he had in years. Relaxed, happy, human. The transformation was obvious even to him. They were going to use these against me, he realized. Show the families that Richard Torino had gone soft. Or show law enforcement that you had a personal relationship with a federal agent, JD added quietly. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Tony hadn't just been feeding information, he'd been orchestrating Richard's downfall from multiple angles. "There's more," Marco said reluctantly. He handed Richard a folder. "Financial records. Tony's been skimming from our legitimate businesses for months, funneling money to offshore accounts." Richard flipped through the documents, recognizing Tony's familiar signatures on transfer authorizations, shell company formations, investment diversions, millions of dollars systematically stolen over nearly a year. "Son of a bitch didn't just betray me," Richard muttered. "He robbed me." JD moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she reviewed the financial evidence. Despite everything, her deception, the impossible situation between them, her presence steadied him. "This level of financial manipulation," she said, "Tony couldn't have done this alone. He needed inside knowledge of your business operations, your personal habits, your security protocols." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Tony had help. Someone else in your inner circle has been feeding him information." JD looked up at Richard. "Someone who's still here." Richard felt the familiar paranoia creeping back, but now it was mixed with genuine fear, not for himself, but for JD. If there was another mole, her life was in immediate danger. "Marco," Richard said carefully. "Who else knew about JD staying here?" "Just the core team, me, Vincent, Carlos, and—" Marco's face paled. "And Detective Morrison. Detective Frank Morrison, Chicago PD, on Richard's payroll for 6 years. The man who provided early warnings about police raids, who'd helped Richard stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Morrison has federal connections, JD said grimly. If he's been playing both sides. Richard's phone exploded with calls. Vincent, Carlos, associates throughout the organization reporting unusual police activity, federal vehicles spotted near their businesses, the systematic unraveling of everything Richard had built. It's starting, he said quietly. Whatever they planned, it's happening now. As if summoned by his words, the penthouse's secure entrance chimed. On the security monitor, Detective Morrison stood at the door, looking nervous and checking over his shoulder repeatedly. That's convenient timing, JD observed, her hand moving subtly toward her concealed weapon. Richard looked at her, this woman who'd saved his life and then revealed herself as his enemy, who was now possibly the only person he could trust in a world falling apart around him. What do we do, he asked. We spring the trap, JD said simply, and we see how far this conspiracy really goes. Detective Morrison's nervousness was almost palpable as Richard opened the door. The man who'd been confidently corrupt for years now fidgeted like a rookie facing his first interrogation. Richard, thank God you're okay. Morrison's eyes darted around the penthouse, taking in the evidence of the night's attack. I came as soon as I heard about the break-in. How did you hear about it? JD asked casually from her position near the kitchen. She'd changed back into her nurse scrubs, playing the part of innocent civilian. Morrison's gaze lingered on her uncomfortably. Police scanners. Your security company called it in. He turned back to Richard. We need to talk, privately. JD's fine, Richard said, settling into his chair in a way that suggested casual confidence while keeping Morrison in clear view. She's been helping with my recovery. Recovery from what? The question hung in the air. Richard hadn't told Morrison about his health issues, yet the man's tone suggested he already knew. Stress-related condition, Richard replied carefully. Nothing serious. Morrison's laugh was forced. Come on, Richard. We've known each other too long for games. You've been sick for months. Everyone knows you've been losing your edge. JD moved slightly, positioning herself where she could see Morrison's hands. The subtle shift wasn't lost on Richard. She was preparing for trouble. Funny thing about rumors, Richard said conversationally. They tend to spread when someone wants them to spread. Morrison's facade began to crack. Look, the feds are closing in. I've been trying to protect you, but there are limits to what I can do. You need to consider your options. What options would those be? Cooperation, information exchange. They're particularly interested in your relationship with... Morrison glanced at JD. Your medical care. Richard felt JD tense beside him. Morrison knew more than he was admitting, possibly everything. Frank, Richard said quietly, how long have you been working for the FBI? The question hit like a physical blow. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but froze when he realized both Richard and JD were watching him intently. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Richard stood slowly, his recovery allowing him to move with something approaching his old predatory grace. You've been feeding information to the feds while taking my money, playing all sides, just like Tony. Morrison's face went pale. Tony's dead, Richard. Killed himself rather than face federal charges. Left behind a confession implicating half your operation. The news hit Richard like ice water. Tony, corrupt, treacherous Tony, was dead, and apparently taking Richard down with him from beyond the grave. What kind of confession? JD asked. Financial crimes, racketeering, murder conspiracy, enough to put Richard away for life. Morrison's confidence was returning. Unless he's willing to cooperate. Cooperate how? Information about the Castellanos, details about your legitimate businesses, and... Morrison looked directly at JD. Full disclosure about any federal agents who might have compromised themselves during this investigation. The threat was clear. Morrison knew JD's identity and was prepared to destroy her career along with Richard's life. Interesting proposition, Richard said mildly. There's just one problem with it. What's that? You're assuming I'm the same man I was 3 months ago. The one who made decisions based on fear and paranoia. Richard moved closer to Morrison. But I'm not that man anymore. Richard, the man I am now makes decisions based on trust. And Frank. Richard smiled, cold and predatory. I don't trust you. Morrison's hand went for his gun, but JD was faster. Her weapon appeared in her hands with professional efficiency, trained center mass on the corrupt detective. FBI, she announced clearly. You're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and accessory to attempted murder. Morrison stared at her in shock. "You're the federal agent, the one who's been building a case against corrupt law enforcement for 3 years," JD finished. "You and Tony weren't just stealing from Richard, Frank. You were selling intelligence to organized crime while collecting federal paychecks." As JD read Morrison his rights, Richard felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't handling a crisis alone. He had a partner. Complicated, dangerous, impossible partner, but someone he trusted completely. The realization terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as Richard arrived for what he knew could be his last day of freedom. 3 weeks had passed since Morrison's arrest. 3 weeks of intense federal scrutiny, media attention, and the systematic dismantling of everything Richard had built. JD walked beside him, no longer hiding her federal credentials, but also no longer trying to maintain professional distance. The impossible situation they'd found themselves in had evolved into something neither had expected, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and growing love. "Your lawyer thinks the immunity deal will hold," she said quietly as they climbed the courthouse steps. "My lawyer thinks a lot of things." Richard adjusted his tie, the expensive suit feeling like armor for battle. "What do you think?" "I think you're doing the right thing." JD's voice was firm. "Tony's confession implicated half of Chicago's organized crime network. Your testimony could dismantle 3 families, including my own." "Including your own," she agreed. "But Richard, what you built, the legitimate businesses, the charitable foundations, the community programs, those can survive. You can salvage something good from all this." Richard stopped at the courthouse entrance, looking at this woman who'd turned his world upside down in every conceivable way. "And us? What happens to us when this is over?" JD's expression softened. "I don't know, I've never been in this situation before." "What situation is that?" "Being in love with someone I was supposed to arrest." The confession hung between them, simple and profound. Richard felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I love you too," he said simply, which is probably the most inconvenient truth either of us has ever faced. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Richard's legal team. Expensive suits, grim expressions, briefcases full of carefully negotiated terms that would dismantle his empire while hopefully preserving his life. "Mr. Torino," his lead attorney approached, "we need to review your testimony one final time." As they entered the courthouse, Richard caught sight of familiar faces in the gallery. Marco, Vincent, Carlos, men who'd followed him loyally for years, now looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright betrayal. By the end of the day, their world would be forever changed. "Second thoughts?" JD murmured. "Every second," Richard replied honestly, "but not about this. Not about us." The hearing progressed with bureaucratic efficiency. Richard's testimony was precise, damning, complete. Names, dates, financial structures, operational details, everything federal prosecutors needed to dismantle organized crime networks that had operated for generations. During a recess, Marco approached them in the hallway. "Boss," he said quietly, "the families are putting out contracts on both of you." Richard wasn't surprised. He'd expected retaliation. "How much?" he asked. $2 million. Each." JD whistled softly. "That's flattering." "It's serious," Marco continued. "You can't go back to the penthouse. Can't go back to any of your usual places. They're watching everything." Richard looked at JD, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. This was the price of their choice, a life forever looking over their shoulders. "There's something else," Marco said hesitantly. "The Venturas want to meet. Tonight they're offering protection." "In exchange for what?" "Your territory, your businesses, everything." Marco's expression was grim. "They're calling it a retirement package." Richard laughed, short and bitter. The families were already carving up his empire like vultures over carrion. "Tell them no," he said firmly. "Richard," Marco started. "Tell them no," he repeated. "I'm done making deals with people who solve problems with violence." As they returned to the courtroom for final testimony, Richard felt the weight of his old life falling away. It should have felt like loss, like defeat. Instead, it felt like freedom. The explosion shattered the courthouse windows at exactly 3:17 p.m. Richard's first instinct was to shield JD, his body moving before his mind processed the sound of shattering glass and screaming. Federal marshals swarmed the courtroom, weapons drawn, shouting orders that were lost in the chaos. "Car bomb," JD said grimly, pulling Richard toward the rear exit. "Professional job, they wanted maximum impact." As they reached the parking structure, Richard saw the smoking remains of what had been his armored sedan. If he'd left the courthouse on schedule, he would have been in that car. "How did they know?" he asked, his mind racing through possibilities. "Same way they've known everything else," JD replied. "Someone on the inside." Federal Agent Sarah Chen approached them, her usually composed expression tight with anger. "Mr. Torino, Agent Martinez, we need to get you to a secure location immediately." "What about the immunity agreement?" Richard's lawyer demanded. "Still in effect," Chen replied curtly, "but protection is now our immediate priority." As they were hustled into unmarked vehicles, Richard caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Vincent Castellano, heir to the family empire, standing calmly amid the chaos with a slight smile on his face. Their eyes met for a moment before Vincent disappeared into the crowd. The safe house was a nondescript suburban home that looked like countless others in the development. Generic furniture, basic amenities, and federal agents posted at every exit. "How long?" Richard asked Agent Chen. "Until we locate and eliminate the immediate threat," she replied. "Could be days, could be weeks, could be never," JD added quietly. When they were finally alone, Richard and JD sat in the small living room, processing everything that had happened. The weight of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were essentially prisoners of their own choices. "Any regrets?" Richard asked. "About testifying, about bringing down the families?" "No." JD moved closer to him on the couch. "About falling in love with you? That's more complicated." "How so?" "Because now we have to figure out how to build a life together when both our old lives are over." She leaned against his shoulder. "I can't go back to being an undercover agent. You can't go back to being a crime boss, so what do we become?" Richard considered the question seriously. For 35 years, his identity had been tied to power, control, the empire his father had built. Now, stripped of all that, he wasn't sure who Richard Torino actually was. "Maybe we become ordinary people," he said finally. "You think you could be ordinary?" "I think I could try. For you." JD was quiet for a long moment. "There's something I haven't told you," she said finally. Richard felt familiar tension return. "What now?" "Before all this started, before I went undercover, I was married." She didn't look at him as she spoke. "FBI agent, killed in the line of duty 3 years ago. That's why I took the undercover assignment. I wanted to disappear into someone else's life for a while." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. "You were grieving." "I was barely functional," JD corrected. "Taking care of you, focusing on your recovery. It was the first time in years I felt like myself again, like I had a purpose beyond revenge." Richard understood grief, the way it could consume everything good in your life. "What was his name?" "David. David Martinez." She smiled sadly. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said the most dangerous criminals were the smart ones who thought they were doing the right thing. Was he right? About you? I think you've spent so many years trying to honor your father's legacy that you forgot to create your own." JD finally looked at him. "But I also think you're brave enough to start over." Before Richard could respond, Agent Chen's voice echoed through the house. "We have a problem. Vincent Castellano just walked into FBI headquarters. He wants to make a deal." Vincent Castellano sat across from Richard in the FBI conference room with the confident ease of a man who believed he held all the cards. At 28, Vincent had inherited his father's criminal empire, along with his calculating intelligence and complete lack of moral constraints. "Richard," Vincent said pleasantly, as if they were meeting for coffee rather than a federal negotiation, "you look healthier than the last time I saw you." "Vincent," Richard's voice was carefully neutral, "I heard you wanted to talk. I want to make you an offer." Vincent leaned back in his chair, ignoring the federal agents watching from the observation deck. "A way out of this mess that benefits everyone." Agent Chen activated the recording equipment. "Mr. Castellano, you understand this conversation is being documented?" "Of course," Vincent smiled. "That's rather the point." JD sat beside Richard, her federal credentials giving her access to the negotiation. Her presence steadied him, but Richard could feel the tension radiating from her. "What's the offer?" Richard asked. "Complete immunity for both of you. New identities, federal relocation. Enough money to start over anywhere you want. Vincent's tone was conversational, as if he were offering vacation recommendations. All I need in exchange is your testimony against the Torino organization. I've already testified against my own organization. Not all of it. Vincent's smile sharpened. There are certain operations, certain financial arrangements that predate your father's death. Things only you would know. Richard understood immediately. Vincent wanted information about the family's historical connections, politicians, judges, business leaders who'd been compromised over decades. Information that could destabilize entire power structures beyond organized crime. Why? Richard asked. Because chaos creates opportunity, Vincent replied simply. When old power structures collapse, new ones emerge. I intend to be well positioned for that emergence. JD leaned forward. What you're describing isn't justice. It's a coup. Justice is a luxury, Agent Martinez. Power is a necessity. Vincent's gaze moved between them. Richard understands this. He spent his entire life navigating the difference. I spent my entire life perpetuating my father's mistakes, Richard corrected. I'm not interested in perpetuating yours. Vincent's expression hardened slightly. You might want to reconsider. The contracts on your lives are still active. My offer provides protection that federal witness security can't guarantee. And if we refuse, then you'll spend the rest of your lives, however long they might be, looking over your shoulders. Vincent stood. I'll give you 24 hours to decide. After Vincent left, the room fell silent except for the hum of recording equipment. He's right about one thing, Agent Chen said finally. Federal protection has limits. If the families are determined enough, we know the risks, JD said firmly. What we need to know is whether the FBI can guarantee our safety if we refuse Vincent's deal. I can't guarantee anything, Chen replied honestly. But I can tell you that giving Vincent Castellano the information he wants would fundamentally alter the balance of power in this city, possibly in several cities. Richard stood, moving to the window that looked out over downtown Chicago. This city had been his responsibility, his territory, his burden for over a decade. Now he was being asked to either help destroy it or accept permanent exile. There's a third option, he said quietly. What's that? JD asked. We end this. Permanently. Agent Chen's expression sharpened. What are you proposing? Richard turned back to face them, his decision crystallizing. Vincent Castellano wants information that could destabilize the entire power structure. What if we gave him exactly what he wants? Richard, JD started, but not the way he expects. Richard moved to the conference table, spreading out files and documents. What if we created a scenario where Vincent gets the information, but in a way that exposes his entire operation to federal surveillance? A sting operation, Chen realized. More than that. Richard's mind was working at full speed now, planning and calculating like he hadn't since before his illness. A complete takedown. Vincent, the remaining families, the corrupt officials they depend on. Everyone. JD studied his face. That's incredibly dangerous. If anything goes wrong, we're dead anyway, Richard interrupted. But if it works, we're free. Really free. The three of them spent the next hour outlining possibilities, risks, contingencies. It was the most complex operation any of them had attempted, requiring perfect timing and complete trust. As the meeting concluded, Richard realized he was no longer the man who'd built his life on control and paranoia. The man sitting in this federal conference room was someone new, someone willing to trust others to take calculated risks for the right reasons. 24 hours, he said to Agent Chen. Can you set up the meeting? I can set it up, she replied. But Richard, once we start this, there's no going back. Richard looked at JD, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. There's already no going back, he said simply. Now we're just choosing which direction to go. The warehouse on Chicago's south side had been abandoned for years, making it perfect for Vincent Castellano's purposes. Industrial shadows, multiple exit points, and enough space for both sides to maintain tactical advantage, or so Vincent believed. Richard arrived at exactly midnight, carrying a briefcase containing everything Vincent had demanded: financial records, political connections, judicial compromises spanning 3 decades of Torino family operations, information that could topple governments and destabilize entire economic systems. Vincent waited with his usual confident ease, flanked by armed associates who scanned the shadows for threats they couldn't see coming. "Richard," Vincent called out as he approached, I have to admit I wasn't certain you'd come. I keep my word, Richard replied, setting the briefcase on a metal table between them, even when I probably shouldn't. Where's your federal girlfriend? Agent Martinez is maintaining professional distance from this transaction, Richard said carefully. As you can imagine, her supervisors weren't enthusiastic about her personal involvement in these negotiations. Vincent laughed. Personal involvement. Is that what we're calling it? He gestured to one of his men, who began examining the briefcase contents. You know, Richard, in another life we might have been allies. Your strategic thinking, my ambition. We could have run this entire city. In another life, maybe. Richard watched Vincent's associate photograph documents, upload files to secure servers, systematically catalog everything that would give Vincent unprecedented power. But I've learned that some prices are too high to pay. Such as? My soul. My conscience. My chance at happiness. Richard's voice was steady, certain. Things I didn't know I still had until recently. Vincent's expression shifted slightly. Agent Martinez really changed you, didn't she? She helped me remember who I was before I became what my father needed me to be. And who was that? Someone who believed in justice, in protecting people instead of controlling them, in building something good instead of just maintaining something powerful. Vincent's associate finished his review and nodded to his boss. Everything was authentic, comprehensive, devastating to every power structure Vincent intended to challenge. Excellent, Vincent said, closing the briefcase. You've just handed me the keys to the kingdom, Richard. I almost feel guilty about what happens next. What happens next? Vincent's smile turned predatory. You and Agent Martinez disappear. Permanently. I can't risk having you change your minds about our arrangement. Richard had expected this. Vincent Castellano didn't make deals. He made temporary truces before eliminating potential threats. That would be unfortunate, Richard said mildly. For you, certainly. For all of us, actually. Vincent's expression sharpened. Meaning? Meaning every document in that briefcase is authentic. And every document in that briefcase is also tagged with federal surveillance markers that activated the moment you opened it. The warehouse suddenly flooded with light as FBI tactical teams emerged from concealment. Laser sights painted red dots across Vincent's associates, and Agent Chen's voice echoed through loudspeakers. FBI, everyone on the ground, now! Vincent stared at Richard with something approaching admiration. You son of a bitch, you played me. I learned from the best, Richard replied, as federal agents swarmed the scene. My father always said the most dangerous enemies are the ones who make you think you're winning. As Vincent was arrested, he called out to Richard, this doesn't end it, you know. There are always more families, more players, more people willing to do whatever it takes for power. Maybe, Richard acknowledged, but that's not my problem anymore. Agent Chen approached as the scene was secured. All the surveillance markers activated perfectly. We've got real-time access to Vincent's entire network now. Financial transactions, communication patterns, operational details. This should wrap up organized crime in Chicago for the next decade. And us? Richard asked. Free and clear. Vincent's arrest validates your immunity agreement, and his confession implicates everyone except you two. Chen smiled. Congratulations, Mr. Torino. You're officially a private citizen. 6 months later, Richard sat on a beach in North Carolina, watching JD teach swimming lessons to local children. She'd started a community health program in their small coastal town, combining her medical expertise with her natural teaching ability. Richard himself had surprised everyone, including himself, by opening a legitimate consulting business, helping small companies develop ethical business practices. Former mob boss turned corporate conscience wasn't a career path anyone had predicted, but it suited him. His phone rang. Agent Chen's name appeared on the screen. Sarah, he answered. Everything okay? More than okay. Vincent's network led us to corruption cases in 6 states. The ripple effect of your testimony is still unfolding. That's good news. There's something else. The families that put contracts on your lives. They're all either in federal custody or too busy fighting each other to worry about revenge. You're officially off everyone's target list. Richard felt a weight he'd carried for months finally lift from his shoulders. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you, Richard. What you did took incredible courage. After ending the call, Richard walked down to the beach where JD was packing up her swimming equipment. Good news? She asked, noting his expression. The best news. Richard pulled her close, tasting salt air and freedom in equal measure. We're really free now, JD. All of it's over. And what do we do with our freedom? Richard looked around at their small town, at the life they'd built from the ashes of their old existence. We do what ordinary people do. We fall in love, we build a home, we help our community, we be happy. Think you can handle ordinary? Richard kissed her, tasting possibility and promise. With you, I can handle anything. As the sun set over the Atlantic, Richard Torino, former Mafia boss, federal witness, redeemed man, walked hand in hand with the woman who'd saved his life in every way that mattered. Behind them, the shadows of Chicago's criminal underworld faded into memory. Ahead lay everything they'd never dared hope for: peace, love, and the extraordinary ordinariness of a life lived freely. They'd both learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is choose love over power, but they'd also learned that sometimes that choice is the only one that leads to true victory. The Mafia boss was dying when he met the nurse, but the man who loved her was finally, completely alive.